Hey, good morning. This is Jack Ryan from the Legal and Liability Risk Management Institute, and today I want to talk to you about law enforcement authority during this state of emergency that we're currently in. But again, these concepts are applicable to more than just this event, and they're actually applicable to all events. This one just happens to be one that seemed unfamiliar, but I think as I give you some background, I think you'll see that it's something that law enforcement anticipated for a number of years from similar events. So just to give you a little background, PERF, Police Executive Research Forum, and the United States Department of Justice got together back in 2006 and put together a document after some study on law enforcement's response to the role of law enforcement in public health emergencies. Again, this was related to one of the flu epidemics or pandemics. In fact, PERF noted in their report, and I think about this number, that in the flu pandemic of 1968 and 1969, about 700,000 people died worldwide. So again, this is a pandemic, which is the emergence of a virus. Most people have little or no immunity, causes serious illness, and it spreads easily from person to person worldwide. And that's exactly what we're seeing now with this COVID-19. So again, here we are, 17 years later, and I think this was an anticipation that these kinds of things could and would happen in the future. I think, as is pointed out in the documents that I'm reading, and I'm trying to do all kinds of research to hopefully help keep you better informed as you work on the front lines and don't necessarily have time to do this research and whatnot. But, law enforcement has to balance a number of things. One, we've got governors, we've got mayors, we've got even the federal government putting out regulations on quarantine, on travel, on the number of persons present in a particular place, on social distancing. I went into Walgreens yesterday to pick up some medication for my mom, and they've got boxes taped on all the floors, 6 feet apart, all over the store, so that people don't enter each other's space. And law enforcement's also still got to do everyday service demands. Now, in other briefings, we've talked about the idea that maybe we should limit those responses and those service demands. We've got shrinking resources. One of the things that's going to happen, and I covered this in another briefing, Detroit has a tremendous amount of officers who have tested positively or are quarantined. NYPD does. I brought up the fact that even Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm from and where I did my career, we had 10 officers following an arrest that had to be quarantined at least until the suspect was tested. Then you're going to have some officers who are either A, going to decide it's too dangerous to contract COVID-19 and they may not come to work. They may report out sick and say they've got some symptoms, and obviously we always take that very seriously. And again, I'm not suggesting that officers are going to malinger. That's not the point. But officers do have elderly parents maybe living with them. They might have other issues. So there may be reasons why they decide that it's, they're not going to come to work. We saw that, and I think PERF points this out, or at least some document. We saw that in Hurricane Katrina, where hundreds of New Orleans officers just didn't show up for work, notwithstanding the fact that they were in the midst of a major emergency. Sorry about that. Hey, one of the things that PERF pointed out in 2006 was the fact that the diseases that should be the most concern to law enforcement are the ones that are spread by casual contact. Officers are going to be repeatedly exposed as they deal with community members. So that's going to increase the number of officers who actually get it because it's a casual contact exposure. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Although this was a 2006 document, it's exactly what we're seeing here with COVID-19. So that casual contact, handshakes, being within somebody's space, all of those things that make this the kind of disease that should be the most concerning to law enforcement. Hey, it has been pointed out that personal protective equipment is the most necessary component when you're dealing with an effective all hazards disease control plan. We have known for years that we have tried to protect ourselves from a number of diseases. Officers carrying latex gloves. Now we want those respirator masks, particulate masks of at least that N95. I had an officer reach out to me yesterday and sent me some good news from his agency up in Concord, New Hampshire, because somebody had donated a number of masks to the agency. So again, we see that we're seeing a lot of good stuff happening. Here in Rhode Island, we have a lot of boat builders, and they work around fiberglass, so they have a lot of respirators, and we're seeing carpentry companies. We're seeing a lot of folks, painters, all turning over masks to law enforcement. So that's a very positive thing. Obviously not required by law, but something that folks are doing. Hey, I don't know. I was not thinking about social distancing until the last few weeks. But here is, from Perth in 2006, talking about social distancing by eliminating handshaking, increasing physical separation of persons at work, eliminating non-essential meetings, using telecommunications for as many business and personal interactions as feasible, and any other measures to limit personal contact. I mean, we're seeing this in law enforcement right now. I'm talking to a lot of agencies on a daily basis that are limiting the calls for service they go to. If it's a non-emergency call, it's not in progress. If it's just a call where an officer that at most is going to take a report, then they're not sending an officer. They're taking the information over the phone. We see officers, and again, we've mentioned this in other briefings, doing less discretionary stops, not putting themselves in a position where they're going to be exposed, so that they are available when we need them for the most important public safety issues that inevitably occur in all of our areas. Again, from a standpoint of the community, we see the community. We see governors and we see mayors closing bars, restaurants. In Rhode Island here, we're limited to takeout at restaurants. We see sporting events closed, all the major sports. My son, who loves golf and loves to watch golf, is like going crazy because there's no golfing events on, and as many of you know, some of you are into March Madness and whatnot. All of these things shut down, and it's all this idea of social distancing to create less exposures that inevitably would be happening in a person-to-person type spread, which COVID-19 is. So again, that's the idea of avoiding it. Hey, I will tell you that it is pointed out by the CDC that the most realistic way to restrict large numbers of people from gathering is to persuade them to stay home. And they point out that involuntary quarantine is it's seldom necessary, but it really doesn't always accomplish what you need to accomplish. Sometimes you get more through request than through order. And again, there's a lot of people that will fight you on that because of their individual liberties, and it's more widely resisted when it's an involuntary. When it's voluntary, we tend to get more people to follow it. So again, I've included these 10 principles of modern quarantine, and I think probably the most it requires education, trust, and the participation of the general public. That almost goes back to the Peelian principles of law enforcement, where Sir Robert Peel said, look, compliance. Most people comply, and there's almost a contract between the public and the police, and most people comply, and that's really what we're trying to accomplish here. And remember, if law enforcement is used to try to accomplish quarantines and that nature, again, it's going to require law enforcement to go into those crowded areas and there'll be more contacts. So, we ought to think about other ways to maybe make these accomplishments, and a lot of it is going to require the education, trust, and participation of the general public. And again, not to make a political statement, but with all of the infighting that's going on, it's sometimes hard for the public to trust what they're hearing. So again, I think we ought to be a conduit for that trust, right? legal principles of enforcement is really what I want to focus on today. And so, one thing that I want to say first, and it's something I alluded to, I hit it hard in I think the first briefing that we did. Every enforcement action is a potential exposure to officers. So again, as I outline this legal authority, it's not a recommendation to run out there and start taking enforcement action, because that comes at a cost, the cost being that the officers are exposed. But I think it is important that officers know what legal authority they have and where that authority comes from. If we have to quarantine law enforcement officers because they are potentially infected, then that will limit our ability to carry out public safety with our diminishing numbers. So really important to remember that. The Supreme Court, and it's an old case, 1905, but this guy Jacobson was arrested because of his refusal to have a vaccination. And the United States Supreme Court held that the mass law requiring vaccination, unless it met one of the statutory exemptions, because there were exemptions, like a doctor would say that a person couldn't have the vaccination for some reason, so there was a health reason why they couldn't have it. So there were some exceptions, but they said that was a valid law because it was to protect the public health. And so now what happens? Now we have this COVID-19 that we've been dealing with now, probably hot and heavy for, 3-4 weeks, probably at its height the last 2 weeks. And we're seeing a lot of different things happening around the country, different jurisdictions. And just by way of example, in Virginia, here's the case where the governor gave police authority to enforce the 10-person limit on gatherings. He did that by an executive order. You can go on the internet and see the governor's executive order from Virginia. And I'm just using Virginia in this instance. This is happening all over the country. It's not just one place. Here's the governor of Alabama. Same thing. She's issued orders as well that give police authority to enforce. It's interesting in Alabama, I think on the gatherings at facilities, I think it's a misdemeanor and it's a $25 to $50 fine. Not a heavy thing, but it's still given law enforcement authority. I happen to pull up one of these executive orders, and this is the executive order signed by the governor of South Carolina. Also, as you go through this order, if you were to pull it up and read the whole thing, you'd see it gives law enforcement the authority to enforce any regulations put out by the governor during the state of emergency. I know I spent time on the phone with a close friend and certainly somebody that I look to for information, Mark Filburn, last week from Kentucky, and we discussed at length the administrative rules, regulations, and enforcement thereof in the state of Kentucky, and how there were statutes in place that allowed officers to take action based on the governor's declaration of emergency and orders that the governor put in place. So again, we see that. I happen to pull an older Center for Disease Control tabletop discussion, and one of the things that was pointed out is that the governor in virtually every state has the authority to declare an emergency, has the authority to put in regulations to deal with that emergency, and has the authority to give law enforcement the ability to enforce those regulations that are put into place. So again, in most of those, in our case, most of what we're going to be enforcing is those regulations, rules put in place by the governor in these cases. I've provided some examples of different state statutes. I just mentioned Kentucky. I don't happen to have them in here, but I just pulled a bunch of different statutes. I just went down the list as they appeared when I did my search this morning. But every state has some law that allows the governor to declare an emergency. Some give regulatory agencies some authority, so your local Department of Health. Most states also give your local entities the ability to declare emergencies within a city, town, or county. So again, there is that. Additionally, remember that there's all kinds of mutual aid allowed under these state laws. So, if for example, let's say a town of 6 officers were to quarantine every single officer in town, that town would be able to call for mutual aid from an adjoining jurisdiction or from somewhere else to get the assistance necessary. Also point out that if you get an offer from any federal agents, FBI, ATF, things of that nature, they generally do not have any authority to enforce state law. And there's some really good Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General opinions out there that say, look, if ATF or Secret Service or FBI is going to help local law enforcement during one of these emergencies, that the best action is to deputize them first so that they have the legal authority to enforce state law, because otherwise it'll call into question any enforcement that they make. Obviously, they always have their enforcement authority under federal law, but remember, if they're coming in to help during an emergency at the local level, then we're going to want them to have the authority to enforce state law as well. So again, we see that in these areas. Also, if there's any confusion on this, remember that there's a federal act, Posse Comitatus, that basically says that the U.S. military cannot act to enforce domestic law. So again, they can be called into these emergencies to help with equipment and things like that. And there are some exceptions. But that's why what we see really is the National Guard, and they're brought in not by the federal government. They may be serving under the authority of the federal government, but they're brought in under the authority of the state governor. And so they can help and assist in enforcing state law when they're brought in by the governor. So again, just a couple of things to be aware of in case they come up. Again, this is a state law that is out of North Carolina that provides an example where the state legislature has actually passed a law saying, hey, municipalities, counties, you can enact ordinances with prohibitions during these emergencies. And I'll tell you, they actually have a laundry list of things that they can do, things like curfews, things like shelter in place, all kinds of things that even locally there's authority under state law to do. And most states have provisions like this. So again, that's why we see cities, towns, counties actually invoking their own authority during this state of emergency to try to stop the spread of COVID-19. Hey, one of the other things I'll just point out, and I was doing some research from the National Governors Association, 2019 survey that they did. And actually, the governor of each state, in 42 of our 50 states, has authority to change or suspend statutes or regulations during the emergency. So this is a little bit different than the power to enact regulations under the State of Emergency Act. This is actually the power to suspend different actions. So, for example, they could suspend, for example, the need to register your car. That happened here in Rhode Island. Is they've extended all the dates on re-registering your car because they recognize that that's going to be problematic. We see a lot of states extending the tax deadline for state taxes beyond April 15th. So it allows the governor to change statutes or regulations during the emergency, different than the power to declare an emergency and exercise authority under that. But something else to bear in mind in case you run across where the governor doesn't want a certain thing enforced by law enforcement during this time period. They do have that authority during the state of emergency. This is a map that outlines various states and what the authority is. So in the darkest of the states, the governor can change both statutes and regulations during a declared emergency. In the lighter, but not the lightest color, the governor can only change regulations during the emergency. And in the states that are basically white, there's no explicit authority to make those changes presently. So again, that's some states will differ, but 42 states there is authority to change, and it's only 8 that are not. Hey, I want to thank you for joining me today. As I said, we're in the midst of this emergency. We're trying to bring you as much information as possible. We're trying to do that on a daily basis, sometimes a couple of times a day. We don't know how long this thing will run, but we're trying to do everything we can to keep you updated with information so that you're in the best position to understand role, responsibility, and ways to keep yourself safe and your family safe while carrying out the mission of public safety. So, hey, be safe out there, and thanks again for joining us.